Welcome to the Neurocrush Immersion. In this episode, we're discussing the many phases of neurodiversity, and we intend for this to be a comprehensive masterclass on the full spectrum of human brain variation. We will take the Rudyard Kipling approach. I have 6 friendly men, they taught me all I know. Their names are what, why, who, when, where, and how. Let's ask those questions with regard to neurodiversity. So what is neurodiversity? It describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is really no one right way of thinking, learning, feeling, and behaving. It was coined by an Australian sociologist, Judy Singer, to promote equality and inclusion of what she called the neurological minorities. And the movement that emerged in the 1990s aimed to increase the acceptance of all people while embracing neurological differences with online platforms, enabling people with autism, for example, to interact with one another and form a community. While neurodiversity is a sociological movement, it enables people like me as clinicians also to understand and work with these populations. So who is neurodiverse? Most often we're talking about people with developmental conditions. Autism spectrum disorder is a prime example, but attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, for example, is another example of people who are neurodiverse. Developmental conditions like epilepsy can also make people neurodiverse. And this is something that we need to understand. Now, in autism, we have the primary problems of language development, communication, socialization, and emotional expression. People also struggle with hypersensitivity issues. Their sensory problems include hypersensitivity to touch, to sound, to noise, and even tactile sensations. For example, the texture of something they are wearing or the texture of something that they are eating. When suddenly confronted with some of these stimuli, the person who is neurodiverse, for example, the person with autism, may behave abnormally or may be startled in a way that people find very surprising. And that is one example of neurodiversity. Now, when you think about it, we accept these changes and problems in people who have diagnosed autism, diagnosed ADHD, especially children, and we work with them quite easily. And in fact, if you think about it, increasingly, society is becoming more acceptable of such early problems. But what if you were neurodiverse in less obvious ways and grew up not realizing you were neurodiverse, and with people around you not realizing that you are neurodiverse? Now that can pose a number of problems because you may end up feeling a misfit a lot of the time, or indeed people around you regarding you as a misfit a lot of the time. There are other examples of neurodiversity in our clinical practice and in our society. People with ADHD can often be impulsive, voluble, loud, emotionally volatile, and we don't realize that it's their ADHD that makes them that way. People with temporal lobe epilepsy have been described to have what's been called the Geschwin syndrome. They can be hyper-religious, hyper-graphic, they write a lot but not necessarily creatively, and hyposexual. And these things make them neurodiverse or different. And in fact, all you have to do is read Ramachandran's Phantoms in the Brain to, there's a whole chapter called God and the Limbic System that talks about a person who was with temporal lobe epilepsy presented with all these features. People with certain personality disorders, for example, borderline personality disorder, who need to experience pain in order to obtain relief from intense stress, and hence they tend to indulge in self-harm. So thus, in clinical practice beyond autism, we do encounter various forms of neurodiversity. And if you think back, you've probably encountered your own experiences of neurodiversity in your interactions with people around you. So the question we asked ourselves, therefore, is where do we encounter neurodiversity? We do encounter it in our education settings. We encounter it both in school and in college or university. We also encounter it in our workplaces. And the fundamental issue, if you think about it, is that society is full of round holes. And the person with neurodiversity is a square peg that we are trying to fit into that round hole. And quite honestly, square pegs don't fit into round holes. And that makes them a misfit into the system that we have created. The problem is not just of the person who is neurodiverse. The problem is also of society that is expecting or is failing really to create the right environments for people to express themselves and achieve their potential. So when does one recognize that one may be neurodiverse? As mentioned, when a child manifests with symptoms of autism or ADHD or some of the other developmental conditions we've spoken about, it's much easier to make that diagnosis. Very often I come across people who have reached adulthood without recognizing that they may be neurodiverse, or indeed just recognizing then as they express their independence that they may well be neurodiverse. And they've gone through lives finding difficulty in fitting into various settings with people around them, parents, families, teachers, and even people in the workplace, not understanding why they may have a problem. So thus, neurodiversity is something that can manifest or can be identified at various stages in their life. We even had people who discover their neurodiversity in middle age. Indeed, one tech person who came to consult us did not know that he was neurodiverse. He was in his late 50s. What had happened was he found it so difficult to fit into a conventional workspace that eventually he found a way of working on contract with various organizations, and that kept him employed and happy. He did not have to meet the same people every day because his contract would take him to different locations or different environments, and that helped him cope. He found solitary activity, for example, time spent at the gym or listening to music, as far more productive for himself than having to interact with multiple people. And when we, after a very detailed evaluation, told him that he probably was a high-functioning autism spectrum person, he was so relieved because forever he had blamed himself for his problems, not realizing that it was not something that he was doing deliberately, or a failure on his part. It was indeed the way his brain was wired. His story tells us that neurodiversity not just requires recognition, it also requires a certain amount of acceptance. A Harvard blog on the subject of neurodiversity points out that words matter. Thus, when we address the how of neurodiversity, we need to think about how to address the individual. To give you an example, those like us who work in the field as clinicians or indeed activists prefer to use the terms people with autism, people with ADHD, people with epilepsy, and so on. Research has shown, however, that sometimes people who themselves are suffering from the condition or the problem tend to prefer otherwise. So, for example, they may prefer to be called an autistic person. Knowing how a person would like to be addressed is extremely important, is what the blog points out. Now, if you think that you may be neurodiverse, or indeed if someone around you is having difficulty of the kind that we've spoken about, and you are concerned that they may be neurodiverse, the first thing to do obviously is seek professional opinion. The best people for you to give you this opinion are clinical psychologists and psychiatrists with the right kind of experience in dealing with these problems. Identifying such a person is therefore extremely important. In our setup at Buddhi Clinic, we do a very comprehensive evaluation, which is now both online and offline. And that is something that we find helps us identify through cognition, through behavior, through personality and emotions, and indeed by looking at the person's potentials, help identify neurodiversity and also help give them a path for the future. We need to work to understand the problem once diagnosed, and I think it's extremely important that it's not just the person who does the work, the people who care for them, the people who love them, could be parents, it could be siblings, it could be other members of the family, spouses, friends, close friends, or indeed even an employer needs to understand the problem. Once diagnosed, a person needs to inform key persons in their environment. So, for example, when we work with schools, we often recommend that we draw up with the school a statement of unique needs, and for the school to understand what the unique needs of this child are, how to make the school more productive for the child. In the same way, we can work with families, we can work with empathetic workplaces, we can work with university, but it's extremely important that the organizations where the person is affiliated with or goes to understand the problem. Now, if you actually run an institution which welcomes people who are neurodiverse or has to deal with people who are neurodiverse, what can you do? The first thing to understand is that it's important to be sensitive to their needs, to make adjustments for sound, light, tactile sensitivity, allow them breaks, allow them gadgets like, for example, noise cancelling headphones, allow them flexible seating, the opportunity to work away from their desk from time to time, or indeed work from home if they prefer that. All this is important. Communication with such people often has to be clear. One cannot imply things, one cannot use euphemisms, one should not be sarcastic. Communication has to be direct, transparent, and often it's better when it's written down. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, if one is an inclusive workplace, one has to respect individual needs and capabilities and give the neurodiverse person an opportunity to demonstrate their talents in the setup that they are in, which is the organization that you are managing or working towards. Now, we do end up in situations where we work with clients where we recognize that neither the person is capable of adapting themselves to the organization's needs, nor is the organization capable of adapting itself to the person's needs. And in these circumstances, there is nothing wrong in seeking a change. We have helped, for example, children move into more inclusive schooling environments. We have helped young adults choose careers or choose study methods which are more suitable for them rather than the ones that they had originally chosen. We have helped people choose workplaces or manners of working that are more suitable for them. The key is not to give up. The key is to help identify what works for that individual. In this context, it's extremely important to remember what Howard Gardner has published. Howard Gardner is a famous Harvard psychologist, and what he published was the theory of multiple intelligences. It is not whether one is intelligent, it is how one is intelligent. And the assumption is every one of us is intelligent in certain ways. So understanding your type of intelligence, understanding your potential is extremely important, no matter what form of neurodiversity you or your loved one have. So let's celebrate diversity. Let's celebrate the possibility that we can be inclusive. And let's also celebrate the possibility that every human being can unlock their potential with help and support. In popular discourse, neurodiversity has come to mean autism and ADHD, perhaps dyslexia, perhaps Tourette syndrome. But if we stop there, we risk turning a radical truth into a comfortable brand. Neurodiversity is a description of variation in how human brains generate emotion, regulate attention, construct the self, and make sense of the moral world. Autism and ADHD are not the definition of neurodiversity. They are simply its most familiar and socially acceptable faces. So, neurodiversity has many faces. Some are inspiring: creativity, focus, pattern recognition. Some are unsettling. They challenge our assumptions. And some challenge morality, responsibility, and agency. All of them, however, are profoundly human. Autism is better understood as a difference in how the brain prioritizes information, a difference in salience. It really represents a mind with a different architecture. Autistic brains assign high salience to patterns, systems, sensory input, logical consistency, and predictability. Now, what happens in most social environments is that they demand simultaneous track, facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, verbal content, conversational history, social context, power dynamics, emotional undercurrents, implicit expectations, and cultural norms. Think about the last time you had a conversation with someone. You are unconsciously having to process all this. And you're doing this while generating appropriate responses in real time. Now, most brains process all this automatically below the conscious level. It feels effortless because it literally is. For the person with the autistic brain, there is a need to consciously process what others process unconsciously. And what happens as a consequence is that the cognitive load is immense. The autistic individual is not failing to process social information. They are drowning in it. And this is something very often we fail to understand. Yet, the autistic brain has unrecognized strengths. They are exquisitely attuned to detail, structure, and the internal coherence of systems. They notice what others miss. They remember what others forget. They detect inconsistencies that others tend to gloss over. Therefore, pattern recognition is wonderful. There's an extraordinary ability to see patterns, systems, and logical structures that are invisible to others. There is capacity for sustained, intense concentration on subjects of interest, a very deep focus. There is great value for clarity, consistency, and explicit communication, honesty and precision, sometimes to the point where it can be very hurtful. Research, technical fields, creative domains, environments that value precision, consistency, and systematic thinking transform the same cognitive style from what is considered a liability to a remarkable asset. Many autistic individuals experience emotion very intensely, sometimes overwhelmingly so. The challenge is not feeling, but filtering and interpreting. The first lesson of genuine neurodiversity, therefore, is that autism is not about inability. It is about mismatch. A mismatch between how a brain is tuned and what the environment demands. Change the environment and the disability transforms. The same cognitive style that was a liability becomes an asset. Now let's move on to think about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. The first insight is that attention in ADHD is not absent, it's just poorly regulated. ADHD brains are novelty driven, interest sensitive, reward responsive. They are exquisitely attuned to what is meaningful, urgent, or stimulating.
In ADHD, attention follows interest like water follows gravity. When interest is present, focus is often extraordinary. When interest is absent, focus requires enormous, exhausting effort. Parents of ADHD children who meet me are never tired of telling me this. Oh, when he wants to concentrate, he can concentrate, doctor. And that's the point. That when something is interesting to the brain of a child with ADHD, the child can concentrate. But many things are not interesting, and therefore concentration lapses. The same person, therefore, cannot sit through a class or a routine meeting, but can lose themselves for hours on what they find a fascinating project or subject. Very often for youngsters, these are video games which hold their attention in ways that ordinary text work cannot. The same student can't complete his homework, but can read an entire book that interests him in a single sitting, sometimes even overnight. From the outside, looking at the person, you're seeing willful inconsistency, laziness, defiance. From the inside, it is a brain that is allocating resources differently. Like autism, ADHD also comes with unrecognized strengths. ADHD brains can focus with remarkable intensity, what we call hyperfocus, when the task is intrinsically engaging. They are exquisitely attuned to what is meaningful, urgent, stimulating, or emotionally charged. Entrepreneurs with ADHD launch multiple companies, thrive on novelty and risk. Emergency responders thrive under pressure when stakes are high and action is urgent. Creative professionals generate ideas others cannot imagine and see unexpected connections. Performers come alive in the moment, feed on energy and stimulation. Rapid decision makers excel in dynamic environments requiring improvisation and quick thinking. Thus, in environments demanding creativity, rapid decisions, improvisation, and risk-taking, the very same traits that are considered to be a problem become remarkable strengths. The second lesson of genuine neurodiversity, therefore, is that the same cognitive trait can be a strength or a weakness depending entirely on context. In traditional settings, liability looks like failure and feels like failure. In dynamic settings, the asset, creativity, rapid decisions, and improvisation become very, very successful. What we pathologize in one setting, we celebrate in another. A pattern therefore starts to emerge as you consider all this. Neurodiversity is not about broken brains, it's about differently tuned brains. Different brains address and assign salience differently. They regulate attention differently. They experience the world differently. Different is not a euphemism for worse. It is variation that can be adaptive or maladaptive depending on environment, context, support, and opportunity. Let's move on to talk about another condition that also presents with neurodiversity, but we don't often consider it as neurodiverse: epilepsy. This is a condition where the brain can reveal itself. Epilepsy reminds us that the brain is not a stable machine, but a dynamic, excitable network that can cascade into chaos. Because epilepsy frightens us, we reduce it to seizures, but then that may be our cardinal mistake. What is epilepsy? It is the tendency to have repeated seizures. And what is a seizure? A seizure is an electrochemical discharge, a short circuit in your brain's electrochemical activity that, when it progresses through your brain, causes you to have various symptoms, including becoming unconscious, falling to the ground, shaking, and so on, which is what we are most familiar with. Now, one of the most important places from where seizures emerge is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is also the home to structures central to human experience. When epilepsy affects these structures over months and years, it can shape not just cognition but personality itself. The temporal lobe consists of the following structures: the hippocampus, which consolidates memory and spatial awareness, creates the narrative of our lives. And remember, this is only the size of a small finger joint, and if you insert a finger into both your ears, that's what you'll find right in the middle on either side. Next to it is the amygdala, which assigns emotional significance to all human experience. It determines what matters to us. And remember, the amygdala is a neighbor to the hippocampus. They exist very close to one another. And then we have the wider limbic networks that connect perception, emotion, and meaning into unified experience. Because a lot of epilepsy begins in childhood or adolescence, it offers a unique window into how personality emerges from brain biology. This is not speculation. It is clinical observation accumulated over decades. One of the most important descriptions of the personality in epilepsy is that by Norman Geschwind, a path-breaking behavioral neurologist from Harvard and the guru to most behavioral neurologists who followed him in the next few decades, of whom we are students. The Geschwind syndrome consists of various personality traits in chronic temporal lobe epilepsy. It includes hypergraphia, compulsive, extensive writing, detailed diaries, long letters. The urge feels pressing and irresistible. Professor Michael Trimble has pointed out that while there is an urge to write, it is not necessarily creative writing that the person engages with. Hyper-religiosity, which is intense preoccupation with spiritual, philosophical, or cosmic themes and mystical experiences. An altered sexuality, which includes a reduced interest in sexual activity and a transformation in how sexuality is experienced. Most often, it is hyposexuality, a decreased interest in matters sexual. Sometimes it can become hypersexuality, as it did in the tale of Vincent van Gogh, which is another broadcast subject for us. Viscosity, emotional and conversational stickiness, difficulty in ending conversations, intense attachments, and a deepened emotionality, turbulent inner states, anxiety, mood swings, emotions feeling weighty and overwhelming. These reflect limbic hyperengagement, not moral weakness, the personality imprinted by brain biology. And indeed, Baer and Fedio, who researched this very carefully several decades ago, commented that because you have activity in your brain constantly happening in the temporal lobes, all your sensory experience gets suffused by emotional coloration, which is why there is this deepened emotionality and intensity that the person with Geschwind syndrome suffers. Now, quite the opposite of Geschwind syndrome, which is a syndrome of hyperconnection, is the Kluver-Bucy syndrome, which happens when there is bilateral temporal lobe damage, as in a traumatic brain injury. Now, what do you see there? You see psychic blindness. They cannot recognize emotional significance. A snake may provoke no fear, and this we see in experiments with a monkey with temporal lobe damage. A loved one's face provokes no warmth. Hyperorality, a compulsion to explore objects with the mouth. Things are tasted, licked, and chewed indiscriminately. Hypermetamorphosis, the irresistible urge to explore every visual stimulus. The attention is captured by everything, and quite opposite of the Geschwind syndrome, where there is hyper focus on certain particulars. Here the attention is distributed so widely that they fail to attend to many things. Emotional placidity, fear disappears, emotional responsiveness flattens, threatening stimuli fail to provoke alarm, and this is the monkey not being scared of the snake experiment. And of course, again, altered sexuality. Unlike Geschwind's hyposexuality, there is disinhibited, indiscriminate sexuality, and sexual boundaries tend to dissolve. The key insight is that here there is collapse of emotional salience. Without the amygdala, the world becomes flat and meaningless. Now, we've told you about two different types of neurodiversity that can develop with epilepsy and with brain damage. Now, in Geschwind syndrome, everything matters too much. There is overwhelming emotional meaning to a lot that happens. In Kluver-Bucy syndrome, nothing matters at all. There is emotional absence. So there are two ends of the spectrum of emotional neurodiversity. We accept that people vary in intelligence, memory, attention, and perception, but we rarely acknowledge that people vary in emotional salience, in how much things feel like they matter. We are not just neurodiverse in how we think, therefore. We are neurodiverse in how we feel. Now, quite the opposite of these temporal lobe epilepsy problems is what we see in juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. People with this condition have been described as eternal adolescents by Dieter Jans. On the surface, they are intelligent, articulate, socially engaging, charming, creative, full of ideas, and make an excellent first impression. Underneath, however, is emotional lability, impulsivity, unreliability, disinhibition. They often promise more than they deliver. Plans form and dissolve rapidly. From the outside, therefore, they are irresponsible and engage in willful non-compliance. From the inside, what they have is frontal lobe neurodiversity, difficulty with inhibition, foresight, and planning. The eternal adolescent is not choosing to be unreliable. They experience neurological difficulty with precisely the cognitive functions that reliability requires. What epilepsy teaches us, therefore, is that neurodiversity affects the intensity and quality of feeling. It has an emotional impact. Neurodiversity is experiential. How we experience meaning, significance, and transcendence is determined by this. In epilepsy, because of the episodic nature, it can fluctuate over time and can change with brain activity. And it can become embodied, rooted in physical brain biology, and we can observe and measure it, therefore. The personality itself, the sense of who we are, is not separate from brain biology. It emerges from it, and that is something that epilepsy teaches us. Let's now move on to talk about a slightly uncomfortable and yet important territory, what we call cluster B personality disorders. These conditions are often viewed through a moral lens as manipulative, selfish, dangerous, or evil. But when examined carefully, they are better understood as distinct configurations of emotional processing, selfhood, and empathy. Emotional neurodiversity is at its most challenging here. The one we are all most familiar with is borderline personality disorder, a condition of intensity without breaks. Every emotion, joy, fear, anger, love, shame, everything is felt at double or triple intensity, arising rapidly, escalating quickly, extremely difficult to modulate. There is a problem with identity. It shifts depending on the relationship context, never certain which self is real. There is a problem with attachment. It feels urgent, desperate. Abandonment feels catastrophic and annihilating. There is a problem with perception, idealizing, then devaluing. Savor one day, persecutor the next. And indeed, this is one of the most important defining features of borderline personality disorder, that how you see the world, how you see people is not in shades of gray. You see everything in black or white. You see the same thing as black or white on different days or at different times of the same day. It is not manipulation, it's not attention seeking, it's not a choice. It is a powerful car with faulty brakes. Research shows differences in amygdala, heightened reactivity, the prefrontal cortex, reduced regulation, and the circuits connecting them. And I'll remind you to go back and look at our podcast, listen to the podcast on a tug of war between the rational and the emotional brain, where we've talked about this in great detail. Similar to borderline personality disorder is the narcissistic personality disorder, what we might call the fragile self. The popular image is of arrogance, grandiosity, and entitlement. At the core, however, is profound instability in self-worth, no stable internal sense of value. The self-esteem depends entirely on external feedback. Admiration is present, we feel wonderful, grandiose. Admiration absent, we feel worthless, empty, sometimes deeply depressed. Imagine your sense of being a worthwhile person depended entirely on how others responded to you in this moment. Without active positive feedback, you feel yourself disappearing. Thus, the person with the narcissistic personality disorder from the outside is selfish, arrogant, manipulative. From the inside, desperate, exhausting, profoundly lonely. The third dimension to cluster B personality disorders is psychopathy, which represents the quiet of the limbic system. Intact cognition with diminished emotional salience features here. They can describe what fear, guilt, and empathy are, can recognize emotions in others, can mimic them convincingly, but do not feel them deeply enough for emotion to reliably guide behavior. If you go and listen to my talk on the Godfather paradox, we talk a lot about this, how emotions are shallow and not really felt, but yet expressed as if they are truly felt. Here again, the neurobiological findings are reduced amygdala activity, reduced amygdala prefrontal connectivity, blunted physiological responses to emotional stimuli. With containment, people with psychopathic traits can end up as surgeons, CEOs, special force people, trial lawyers. They all have fearlessness as an advantage. Without containment, they end up as serial killers, con artists, corporate predators, and can cause enormous harm. The same brain, different contexts, radically different outcomes. Therefore, if someone has a psychopathic personality trait accentuation or a psychopathic personality disorder, upbringing, environment, and the experiences they have growing up are really, really important to them. Morality, therefore, can itself be neurodiverse. When we feel morality, right and wrong as emotional realities, gut-level responses preceding reasoning. When we reason morality, logical principles derived and justified, cognitive compass rather than an affective compass. When we instrumentalize morality, moral rules understood strategically, deep emotional investment being absent. Neurodiversity does not predict virtue or vice. It predicts a difference. What determines outcome, therefore, is containment. Containment is the crucial variable. The external structures that shape and constrain behavior, family, community, education, culture, ethics, law, and care. All of these matters. A child with psychopathic traits who has a stable family, clear boundaries, good role models can become a successful and a law-abiding adult. The same child without containment, with an environment of chaos, abuse, and neglect, can become a potentially dangerous individual. The danger, however, is not in the neurodiversity. The danger is in uncontained neurodiversity. So, what happens when we narrow neurodiversity? We tend to lose. Intellectually, we lose because we pretend that neural variation is narrower than what it actually is. We deny the full scope of human brain diversity. Practically, we lose. We fail to develop frameworks and interventions that could help individuals whose neurology makes life difficult for themselves and others. Morally, we lose. We implicitly suggest that some brains deserve understanding while others deserve only condemnation. Humanistically, we lose. We fail to extend the compassion that is ultimately the entire point of the neurodiversity framework. If neurodiversity means anything, it means recognizing that all human minds arise from brains, that brains vary, and that this variation is part of what it means to be human. Not all of this variation is pleasant, not all of it is adaptive, not all of it is safe, but all of it is human. And humans deserve understanding not as a substitute for accountability, but as its necessary companion. Understanding, of course, does not mean excusing. Understanding neurodiversity does not mean excusing harm. Understanding the neurology does not eliminate accountability. What it does, it contextualizes it. A psychopath who expresses violence is still responsible. Understanding psychopathy, however, contextualizes the violence and makes us design paradigms that help the person. Similarly, the person with borderline personality disorder who is prone to emotional abuse is still responsible, but understanding it helps us respond more effectively. The person with a narcissistic personality disorder who is exploiting others is still responsible. Nevertheless, it opens up possibilities for intervention once we understand. The point of extending neurodiversity to difficult conditions is not therefore to excuse the behavior. The point is to understand it well enough to change it. And here I will make a further point that biological interventions for mental health today are advancing at a certain pace, and it is very important for us to understand the neurobiological pinnings of neurodiversity, because the neurobiological underpinnings are what we work with when we modulate the brain, for example, with transcranial magnetic stimulation or transcranial direct current stimulation. So the possibilities that we can intervene in ways that we have not conceptualized is huge, and that possibility is very important for us to consider. What actually works, therefore, is not pure moral condemnation. It's not being satisfied or righteous. It does not reduce harm. It does not help anyone. It is a better understanding, containment, and treatment. It's often imperfect, often slow, but it can work slowly and measurably, and it requires accepting that we are dealing with brains that are different. Understanding, containment, and treatment all require that we first accept that we are dealing with brains, different brains doing what brains do. The self is therefore an emergent phenomenon. If personality can be shaped by epilepsy, if emotional intensity is a function of amygdala reactivity, if moral feeling can be diminished by limbic hypoactivity, if executive function can be compromised by frontal lobe differences, then who are we? Are we our brains? Are we something separate? Are we somehow both? And from here arises a framework for understanding the self. It arises from the interaction of brain, body, environment, experience, relationship, and culture. It is not reducible to any one of these, and it is not separate from any of them. The brain provides constraints and possibilities, a range of cells that can emerge from this particular biological substrate. It's the way we are wired. Experience determines which self within that range actually develops. Environment and choice shape outcomes. This is not determinism. The range is wide, choice matters, effort matters, but it's also not blank state freedom. The brain matters, biology matters, neurology matters. The implications for care is the need for radical compassion. Every person works with a brain that they did not choose. Create space for compassion alongside accountability. Environmental design. Or ask not just how we can fix this person, but how can we design environments that allow different brains to function well. Appropriate containment. Different brains need different structures. Providing external scaffolding is not punishment, it's care. Targeted interventions. Understanding neurology allows more effective intervention. And of course, we also have psychological therapies which are specific to these various contexts. Dialectical behavior therapy, for example, for borderline personality disorder, or schema therapy for narcissistic personality disorder. They work because they target specific mechanisms. And honesty about limits. Not every condition can be fully treated. Accepting this focuses energy where it can actually help. The goal is that understanding makes compassion possible even when compassion is hard. Neurology can inform treatment, and understanding the neurology of a condition allows us to intervene more effectively. Treatments work because they target specific mechanisms, not because they morally reform the individual. And with adequate therapy, stable relationships, and learned skills, many individuals can live meaningful and productive life. This understanding creates possibilities that moral condemnation cannot. I've spent my career working with brains, studying them, treating them, trying to understand them. And I've come to believe something that took me a long time to get my head around. We do not choose our brains. We are, in a very real sense, given our brains by genetics, by prenatal environment, by early experience, by chance. And these brains shape everything: what we feel, how we think, what we want, who we become. This could be a source of despair. If we do not choose our brain, are we responsible for anything? I believe that we do have the choice to make a change. What we are given is a range of possibility, not a fixed destiny. And within that range, choice matters, effort matters, environment matters, relationship matters. The person with intense emotions can learn to regulate them. The person with attention difficulties can build structures that support focus. The person with diminished empathy can learn to act ethically. A range is set by the brain, but what happens within that range is up to us and up to the communities, families, and cultures that contain us. We are different, profoundly neurologically different. And within those differences, we are all trying to become ourselves. We are all trying to find our human potential. What I am asking you to accept is perhaps uncomfortable. We need to accept that neurodiversity includes conditions you find frightening. We need to accept that some brains generate less empathy, more instability, and a different morality. We need to accept that personality is shaped by neurology in ways that challenge our intuitions. We need to extend compassion to people you might prefer to simply condemn. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. Neurodiversity includes every variation in how brains generate emotion, regulate attention, construct identity, process reward, and navigate the moral world. Some minds feel too much, some minds feel too little, some minds feel differently. Some struggle with stable identity, cannot imagine others' inner lives, are chaotic, unpredictable, volatile, rigid, systematic, precise. All are human, all deserve understanding. I began this masterclass by saying that the conversation about neurodiversity has narrowed. I hope I have shown you how to widen it again. not by celebrating every form of neural variation. Some cause suffering that no one should romanticize, not by excusing harmful behavior. Accountability matters, consequences matter, but by extending understanding to the full range of human minds, by recognizing that brains differ in profound ways, by designing environments that allow different brains to function well, by providing containment where containment is needed, by extending compassion to every human being struggling with a brain they did not choose. If we restrict neurodiversity to what feels comfortable, we weaken it. If we allow it to include emotional intensity, instability, and moral complexity, we finally make it true. The invitation, therefore, is not comfort, not celebration, not easy acceptance, but understanding that we need to encompass the full spectrum of human neural variation in all its beauty and all its terror. Understand that makes compassion possible even when compassion is hard. Understanding that recognizes in every struggling mind the same humanity we claim for ourselves exists. This is what the full spectrum of neurodiversity demands. There is a self-evident truth. Neurodiversity exists in all of us. There is no single right way to think, learn, feel, or behave. Human brains vary in their architecture, their wiring, their rhythms, their sensitivities, and that variation is not an aberration to be corrected. It is the norm. It is the source of human creativity, innovation, and adaptability. In our clinics and classrooms, we have a paradox. We keep encountering children who don't fit, whose brains work brilliantly in some ways and struggle profoundly in others. Children who confound our categories and confuse our systems. Let's look at some examples. Meet Arjun, age 8. He has extraordinary strengths. He solves calculus problems that would challenge university students. He sees patterns in numbers the way a musician sees patterns in sound. Yet, he has a significant challenge. He cannot organize his school bag. He loses his tiffin box every day. Homework ends up crumpled, unfiled, or never submitted. He is so smart. Why can't he just get organized? It's often a question that plagues parental minds. Here's another example. Meet Meera, age 14. Her extraordinary strength is poetry that would move adults to tears. She has profound insights into human emotion, facility with language, captures the ineffable in words. Yet she has a significant challenge. She cannot tolerate the school cafeteria. The noise, the chaos, the smell, all of it overwhelm her. She eats alone, and when things get loud in any environment, she tends to shut down. Her teachers think she is dramatic. Her classmates think she is weird. Her parents wonder what is wrong. Meet Vikram, age 22. Has extraordinary strengths, holds forth brilliantly on quantum mechanics, philosophy, history of mathematics. He can turn complex conceptual problems over with remarkable sophistication. Yet, he finds it hard to hold a job for more than 3 months, finds it hard to navigate unwritten social rules. He takes everything literally. He is profoundly lonely and doesn't understand why the world doesn't make sense. And his parents wonder what will happen to him despite his brilliance. The central questions: are these individuals gifted? Are they neurodivergent? Are they disordered? The answers are yes, yes, perhaps, and yes. What is twice exceptional? People who are both gifted and neurodivergent, whose extraordinary abilities coexist with significant challenges, whose brains don't fit the neat categories our systems have created. They can be exceptional in intellectual ability, creative capacity, domain-specific talent, pattern recognition, and deep expertise, but they get challenged by being in the autism spectrum, having ADHD, having dyslexia or dysgraphia, having disorders of sensory processing, being anxious, and having mood conditions. The critical insight is that our failure to recognize this complexity, our insistence on sorting brains into tidy boxes, is causing immense harm to some of our most remarkable minds. Let's talk a little bit more about neurodiversity and giftedness, the biological foundations, and why our definitions need revision. Neurodiversity refers to natural variation in brain structure and function, different patterns of connectivity, different balances of excitation and inhibition, different developmental trajectories. This is a biological fact. From an evolutionary perspective, if one brain type was optimal, evolution would have converged on it. Variation persists because it's adaptive. Different brains suit different challenges. The key insight, therefore, these conditions are not simply disorders to be fixed. They are differences in how the brain processes information with distinctive strengths our clinical language obscures. And I'd like you to go back and listen to our Many Faces of Neurodiversity podcast masterclass that's talked about the large spectrum of neurodiversity that we deal with. Neurodivergent conditions are recognizable constellations of traits that cluster together, not random variations, but forming meaningful patterns. Beyond deficits, however, neurodivergent individuals have strengths. In autism, the clinical focus is on social communication deficits, but inside the person is intense focus, deep expertise, exceptional pattern recognition, sensory acuity, and cognitive honesty. In ADHD, the clinical focus is on inattention and hyperactivity. Inside, the person is capable of hyper-focus on motivating tasks, highly creative, generating novel connections, energetic, willing to take risks. In dyslexia, the clinical focus is reading difficulties. Inside, there is enhanced spatial reasoning, 3D visualization, big picture thinking, and these qualities are overrepresented among architects, engineers, entrepreneurs, people in design. A fish is not disabled because it cannot climb trees. Put a fish in water and it's magnificently competent. And that's a lesson we need to learn with neurodiversity. The IQ intelligent quotient approach is therefore flawed, and giftedness goes much beyond an IQ score. IQ tests have limited scope. They don't capture creativity, practical intelligence, emotional insight, or artistic ability. They can often be very misleading for the twice exceptional. Slow processing or weak working memory pulls down composite scores, obscuring peaks. And they can often miss qualitative differences. Gifted minds don't just think faster, they think differently. And therefore, there is the Columbus Group definition of giftedness. Giftedness is asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awareness that are qualitatively different from the norm. The key, therefore, is this combination of asynchrony with intensity and a quality difference. Dabrowski described 5 overexcitabilities in these people, areas of heightened sensitivity and responsiveness that we see in gifted individuals. One is psychomotor hyperexcitability, surplus energy, rapid speech, physical restlessness, and a need for action, often mistaken for ADHD. The other is sensual hyperexcitability, heightened sensory experience, intense response to music, art, beauty, or being sensorily overwhelmed. The third is intellectual hyperexcitability, insatiable curiosity, a love of learning, deep questioning,